Hello and welcome to World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Italian police have arrested a Ukrainian man suspected of involvement in the 2022 Nord Stream pipeline explosions, which damaged gas lines from Russia to Germany. Now, the attack came months after Russia's invasion of Ukraine and marked a major escalation in energy tensions. And now the arrest comes as Russian sabotage operations against the West continue to rise. Now, joining me now to discuss all this and more is Ján Michalčák, former head of Unit for Countering Hybrid Threats at the Czech Defense Ministry. Ján, thank you so much for being with us here on World Talks. Now, let me go straight in and ask you this and ask you just, your take on this. What does this arrest of this Ukrainian suspect, do correct me if I'm wrong, his name so far, what we do know is linking Serhiy K. What is this telling us about how close investigators are to actually solving this Nord Stream mystery?
Good afternoon from Brussels. Thanks for having me. As you correctly said, Mr. Serhiy, as we got to know him from the media, has been arrested in Italy and will most likely be extradited shortly to Germany, where an international investigation already concluded, I think late last year, that a pro-Ukrainian group was most likely behind the sabotage attempt. Of course, we're talking about a war. Let's remind your viewers that in a war, in a defensive war that Ukraine is waging, it is acceptable, even according to international law, to attack enemy infrastructure. And Nord Stream has been, or was, enemy infrastructure definitely, because it was Russia that had been using energy as a weapon. And so in a war, pinpointing the exact victim and the exact perpetrator of an attack is definitely always difficult, because you're never going to get an official admission of guilt by no side, by Ukraine or Russia. No one's going to say, I did that, I didn't. So I didn't, they say I didn't do that, but admission of guilt is something that we shouldn't probably wait for. But as I said, the international investigation already concluded that most likely a pro-Ukrainian group was behind the attack.
So let me ask you, you just said that, in fact, it was concluded. So is it safe to say then that Kyiv was behind this sabotage in this case?
As I said, nothing in a war is 100%, definitely not when the war is still ongoing. So we'll probably have to wait a couple of years after the war has hopefully ended. And
wow, a couple of years after the war.
Something definite, sorry.
A couple of years. That's quite a long timeline. Wow.
That's my guess, but hopefully it will be sooner. But of course, we don't know at this point when the war will end. And afterwards, I think that at some point in the hopefully near future, we might get a look into the archives that definitely do exist somewhere and might tell us what the clearer picture is. But we shouldn't expect that in a few weeks or months, I'm afraid. It will take longer.
Let me ask you this. How does all of this play out into Russia's narrative? The fact that we're pointing at fingers, of course, at Ukraine and the West, and of course, like you're saying, the investigation has come to an end. How is Russia looking at all of this?
Oh, two things. The first thing, obviously, you will know as well as I do, nothing like that would have happened if Russia hadn't started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. If Ukraine it was behind the attack, it was merely a response to the ongoing aggression, because, as I said, Russia had been using energy as a weapon and had kept European allies, such as Germany, massively dependent on its energy, and the Kremlin was profiting from it. So that's the first thing. And the second thing, of course, just the fact that we and many other media sources are discussing a possible Ukrainian blame, possible Ukrainian guilt, does play into the Kremlin's propaganda's cards, definitely, because they can pinpoint, look, Ukraine did that. We're not the only bad guy here, and even they are committing crimes. Which, as I said, even if it really was Ukraine, the attack is allowed under international law, because Ukraine is waging a defensive war, so is allowed to attack enemy infrastructure.
It's an interesting point you make, but now I want to ask you about Poland and its involvement or non-involvement. Do you think that Warsaw is still under suspicion, or is this arrest going to help clear Poland's name?
I'm not sure. You correctly mentioned that at one point multiple suspects were being mentioned in the media, but my feeling, and I'm not an expert on this particular file, but my feeling, judging from the open sources that I've been able to read, is that now it's pretty much boiled down into either Ukraine or Russia, because quite logically, those two sides would have been the two most interested in doing something like that. So Poland is probably off the hook. But speaking of Poland, I don't know if you maybe wanted to talk about it as well, but let's just mention that Poland, including some other allies as well, has itself been the target of Russian sabotage attempts in the not so distant past.
Absolutely. I do want to get into that. I mean, I mentioned this in the introduction of this episode, but now how do you see that? I mean, let's talk about also the drone, right, that was found on Polish territory. I mean, please give us a little bit more details onto that.
Right. It's probably worth mentioning at the start that the main goal that Russia has pertaining to the West, to the allies of Ukraine, to the EU and NATO, is not necessarily to attack straight up, not to launch an invasion of its own against Europe, for example. But the main goal that we've seen over and over again in the not so distant past is to weaken the West, so that more and more polarization is soon in our societies, and we stop believing our institutions, the democratic establishment that we luckily have in our countries, and that's very generally called hybrid warfare. And we've seen Russia conducting open hybrid warfare against us. That includes Poland, that includes Czechia, Ukraine itself, of course, multiple times. A recent paper by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, for example, has found that until August 2025, more than 40 hybrid attacks against us, against the West, so to speak, have been carried out by Russia. For example, there's been the recent bombing of DHL postal planes that happened simultaneously in Warsaw, the UK, and Germany. And more likely than not, that was seen by Russia as a test ground, a very cynical test ground, to see if such a coordinated attack would work. It did. Luckily for us, at this point on the ground, no one was injured, no one died. But that demonstrates that Russia is more than capable of conducting such an attack in air. And I don't have to, tell you what would have happened had the bombs detonated.
So let me ask you this. You're talking about that. That's a very, very interesting point that you mentioned there, Ján. So you're saying, that Russia has this ability. But now my question to you is then, where is the security coming from these other countries?
I'm not sure I get what you're specifically asking, but of course, just the mere fact that Russia has been conducting such attacks covertly, because as I said, it's a hybrid war and they're never going to openly say, look, it's us, it's Russia, we're attacking the West. It's done more or less in secrecy. And that in itself, by definition, of course, makes it difficult for the intelligence services of the West to uncover such attacks or attempts before they actually happen.
So let me ask you this. So, what do you suggest then that Europe, that our region can actually do to improve the security system and to try to try to be away from these acts of, although of course it's difficult, like you said, it's almost impossible even for intelligence to sometimes see it. But what could be improved in our system?
That's a great question, and I'm afraid I'm going to be a little cynical, but it has to be said. We need to change our mindsets first and foremost, and we need to finally come to grips with the fact that we whether we like it or not, already at war. Yes, it's not an open invasion by Russia, but Russia itself openly admits day after day on its state media that it considers the West an enemy and that it fully considers this conflict to be a confrontation with NATO and with the European Union. And until we fully realize that this is a war, and we're lucky that it's not an open war and people are not dying, at least not in the tens of thousands, such as in Ukraine, and until we realize that, nothing substantial is going to change. So after we switch our thinking and then maybe to an extent even economies into a warlike thinking, warlike mindset, that's something that would be necessary. And until that happens, I'm afraid we are never going to be fully able to counter such covert attempts.
Yeah, and let me ask you this. How do you think that relations, or I mean, would they, in general, Ukraine's relations will be affected with Germany and other European allies over this arrest, over Sergei's arrest, and how is that going to look like?
I mean, sure, no country in the world would be happy about the fact that someone attacked its infrastructure because, as I said at the beginning, yes, it was Russian infrastructure, but of course, even Germany was dependent on it, and they're not going to be happy about it disappearing. On the other, again, I have to be cynical here, but it needs to be said, Germany was the one until very recently, and it pains me to say it, Germany was the one ignoring the fact that Russia had launched an invasion of Ukraine already in 2014. This is not a new war we're talking about. Yes, the full-scale invasion started in 22, but it's been going on for 11 years now. And Germany and many other European states have been ignoring it, or were ignoring it, until 23 maybe, and were happily buying cheap energy from Russia and building their entire economies and the economic successes that Germany undoubtedly had until recently, unfortunately for all of us, on cheap Russian oil and gas. And that needs to stop. Unfortunately for all of us, what it took was the explosions of the pipelines. And now finally we're seeing a change of hearts in Germany. And I hope it's going to stay that way even after the war hopefully ends soon. Because Russia is not a friendly country. And we need to finally realize that.
Thank you so much, Ján Michalčák, former head of unit for countering hybrid threats at the Czech Defense Ministry. Thanks for all your insight here with us on TVP World.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.